The Nine Realms stood beneath a cold sky, where silver mist moved through the great roots of Yggdrasil and pale light touched the halls of Asgard. In those days, the tree that held every realm together was more than a symbol, because its living branches carried balance, memory, and life itself. When the air stayed warm, the realms stayed calm, but when frost reached the roots, every world began to weaken. That was why the first frozen leaf caused such fear, because it meant something had gone wrong deep beyond the reach of ordinary gods. Thor, the thunder god with bright red hair and a heavy heart, saw the leaf break apart in his hand, and he knew the cold was not natural. Loki, the sharp-minded trickster with long black hair and a careful smile, saw the same sign and understood the danger faster than most. Thor wanted to protect Asgard by force because that was how he always met danger. Loki wanted to survive the coming storm because he knew that if the realms fell apart, no one would be safe, not even him. Far below, in the heart of Niflheim, a forbidden frost blade had been forged in secret, and its first breath of power had already begun to freeze the branches of Yggdrasil. The blade did not merely cut flesh or stone. It cut hope, trust, and warmth, and that was why the threat mattered so much. If the curse reached the center of the tree, the Nine Realms would sink into endless winter, and Asgard would become only another shell of ice. Thor first heard the warning from a trembling rune keeper named Edda, a woman with white hair and a worn blue cloak, who served the old forged temples and knew the ancient signs. She had spent her life reading cracks in stone and sparks in metal, and now she had seen frost forming inside a sacred forge that had never known cold. She told Thor that the blade was not just dangerous, but meant for a king who wanted the worlds to suffer until they bowed in fear. That king was Victor, a silent warlord of Niflheim, a man with gray hair and a face shaped by cold anger, who believed that sorrow was the strongest force in any realm. Victor had once lost his own family to a long and brutal winter, and instead of healing, he had turned his pain into a weapon. He wanted the Nine Realms to feel the same helpless grief he had known, because he believed only shared suffering could create true order. He had forged the frost blade in the heart of Niflheim, where the deepest ice never melted, and he had fed it with mourning, rage, and broken oaths. When his warriors began crossing the icy bridges toward the outer realms, even the proud shields of Asgard started to tremble. Odin was gone from the hall on a secret duty far beyond the story of this night, so Thor had to act without waiting for help. Yet the worst blow came from the thing Thor trusted least, because the blade could not be stopped by brute strength alone. It responded to grief. The colder a heart became, the stronger it grew. That meant Thor would have to fight in a way that made him face feelings he usually buried under noise and thunder. It also meant Loki, who understood hidden failings better than anyone, might be the only one who could help, even though Thor hated depending on him. The first meeting between them was bitter and tense, because Thor accused Loki of hiding the truth, while Loki accused Thor of charging ahead without thought. Their argument shook the forge hall and sparks jumped from the iron floor as both men spoke too harshly. Yet when Edda showed them a branch of Yggdrasil iced over from root to leaf, they both fell silent. The damage was already spreading, so the two sons of Asgard made a grim pact. Thor would bring raw power. Loki would bring guidance, trickery, and the kind of insight that could slip through cracks where strength could not. Neither one trusted the other fully, but the danger was larger than pride, and they both knew it. Together they rode out across the frozen span between realms, where snow moved sideways under dark winds and broken banners snapped like warning voices. Along the way they met Freya, a shield captain with golden hair and bright armor, who guarded a bridge shrine and had sworn to protect travelers from the cold raids of Niflheim. She was brave, steady, and furious that the balance had failed under the watch of the gods. Freya told them that Victor had gathered not only warriors, but also broken spirits from the edge of the wild lands, people who had lost homes, families, and hope. He had promised them protection if they served his winter march. That made the threat even worse because Victor was not only fighting with steel, he was building an army from sorrow. As the storm grew stronger, the realms themselves began to react. In one place, rivers froze so fast that fish were trapped in clear ice. In another, a village hearth went dark in a single breath. The winter was no longer staying in Niflheim. It was climbing outward, one fear at a time. Thor and Loki reached the first rune forge at dusk, a ring of black stone and old metal tools buried in the side of a mountain, where the ancestors of Asgard once shaped storm weapons for the guardians of the realms. The forge was sealed by ancient locks that responded only to truth, courage, and the force of thunder. Thor stepped forward first, but the stone rejected him because his anger was loud and his heart was not calm. Loki laughed once, but it was not cruel because he knew this was the moment where strength alone would fail. Then he did something surprising. He admitted that he was afraid. He said he feared being forgotten if the realms fell, and he feared that Thor would never see him as anything more than trouble. The forge listened. The locks opened. Thor saw then that the old magic did not care for pride. It cared for honesty. Together they guided thunder through the rune channels, and the forge woke with deep blue light. From its heart came a storm spear, not to replace Thor, but to help him carry power to the place where the blade curse would be strongest. Yet their victory did not last long, because Victor had expected them there. His frost warriors arrived on a slope above the forge, and with them came a towering champion named Vance, a man with white hair, a shattered shield, and eyes that glowed with frozen grief. Vance had once been a defender of Niflheim, but Victor had used his pain to remake him into a weapon. He could turn sorrow into ice, and every strike from his blade spread a cold that slowed the body and buried the mind in heavy memories. When Vance saw Thor, he raised his weapon and said that every realm deserved to feel the pain of loss. Then the battle began. Lightning crashed through the forge smoke, frost burst across the stone, and the mountains shook under their clash. Thor met Vance blow for blow, but every time thunder struck, the warrior answered with a wave of ice that swallowed the ground and made the fight harder. Loki moved through the edges of the battle, cutting ropes, breaking supply lines, and tricking the frost soldiers into striking empty air. He did not fight like Thor, he fought like a shadow with a purpose. Still, Vance kept advancing, and the forge began to crack under the pressure of the storm. Then came the twist that changed everything. Edda, the rune keeper, revealed that the blade was not only fed by grief from the outside. It was also linked to Yggdrasil through a hidden root seal that had been placed long ago by someone in Asgard. That meant the curse had not simply found a weak point, it had been helped from within. The revelation hit Thor harder than any blow because it meant the danger had roots in betrayal, not just war. Loki understood at once why Victor had seemed so confident. He had not acted alone. He had an ally in the shadows of the higher halls, someone who wanted the realms weakened for reasons still unclear. Thor wanted answers, but there was no time. The frozen branches of Yggdrasil were now visible in the sky, shining like shattered glass, and if the curse reached the central root before sunrise, the tree would lock into endless winter. So Thor did what he had never done before. He stopped fighting only for victory and started fighting for trust. He gave Loki the storm spear, and Loki, in turn, guided him toward the deepest rune chamber beneath the forge. There, under carved stones and old fire pits, Thor placed both hands on the thunder channel and let his power flow without anger. He thought of Asgard. He thought of the realms. He thought of the people who would lose warmth if he failed. Then he thought of Loki, standing beside him instead of behind him, and he understood that strength was not only about striking hard. It was also about carrying another person when the road was too steep. The thunder rose. The forge answered, light poured through the runes in sharp gold lines, and the mountain lit up like a star trapped under stone. Far away, Vance staggered as the ice around his blade cracked and broke. The storm did not end the danger, but it forced the frost warriors back and kept the forge alive for one more push. Thor and Loki stood side by side in the burning light, both breathing hard, both aware that the real war was still ahead. Above them, the branches of Yggdrasil remained frozen, and somewhere in the dark beyond the mountain, Victor was already preparing the next move. The alliance was fragile, the mystery was deeper than they expected, and the 9 realms were still slipping toward winter. Yet for the first time that night, Thor and Loki had found the one thing strong enough to fight the curse. They had found a reason to trust each other, even if only for now, and that was where the next battle would begin. The cold around Yggdrasil did not move like normal winter because it did not come and go with the wind. It clung to the bark, crawled through the roots, and made even the air feel heavy and old. Beneath the frozen world tree, the ground was hard as stone, and the glow from the sacred trunk gave the 2 men ahead a pale, tired light. Thor stood first, broad-shouldered and tense, his bright red hair sharp against the frost, his gold and silver armor marked by blue sparks from the storm spear in his hand. Beside him moved Loki, slim and careful, with long black hair, dark green and black clothing, and eyes that missed almost nothing. Behind them came Edda, the elderly rune keeper with white hair and a worn blue cloak, her leather straps and small metal charms clicking softly as she watched the branches above. They all knew the same thing now. If the frost kept spreading, Yggdrasil would weaken, Asgard would fall into endless winter, and the 9 realms would begin to break apart one by one. Thor wanted to stop Victor with raw force because that was the kind of battle he understood. He had spent his life protecting Asgard by standing in the front line, taking the blow, and answering danger with thunder. Loki wanted something else because he had learned that every locked door had a hidden hinge, and every enemy left a trail if someone was patient enough to look. Edda wanted the truth because she knew the old forge signs and sacred warnings that most others had forgotten. She had seen enough winters to know that this one was unnatural, and she had come because the curse had the smell of forbidden magic, the kind that always begins with pain and ends with ruin. Victor was the one who had made it worse. He was tall, gray-haired, and cold in both face and armor, with frost marks spread across his pale plates and the forbidden frost blade at his side. He was not attacking just to conquer. He was forcing the realms into the same misery that had taken everything from him, and that made him even more dangerous because grief had become his purpose. They moved through a broken chamber under one root of Yggdrasil where the frozen bark had split open like cracked glass. Strange runes glowed inside the wood, pale and sharp, and Edda knelt beside them with a careful breath. She touched the marks and frowned. She said the curse was not only feeding on cold but also on sorrow. That was the true reason it was spreading so fast. The frost blade from Niflheim had been forged to drink grief and turn it into freezing power, and Victor had been using it to push his own pain into the heart of the world tree. Thor looked at her with hard eyes and asked what would happen if they failed. Edda answered without drama, which made her words worse. She said the roots would stiffen, the branches would lock, and the connection between the realms would begin to fail. Then travel would become impossible, the bridges would darken, and Asgard would stand alone in a dead winter while the rest of the world suffered in silence. Loki studied the runes, then studied the snow dust on the floor, and then he noticed something that changed the shape of the whole night. The frost marks did not end at Victor. They continued farther back, deeper into the chamber, where the stone wall had been cut open by a clean and deliberate slash. Behind it was a narrow path leading down, and that path breathed colder air than any place above it. Loki smiled only a little because he had found what he wanted, but his expression still carried worry. He told Thor that Victor had not worked alone. Someone had helped him reach this place, someone who understood the old tunnels beneath Yggdrasil, someone who knew how to hide a forged chamber under a sacred root. That was the first real twist of the night because it meant the curse was not only a weapon of anger. It was also part of a plan, and the plan had been built with careful hands. Thor turned toward Loki at once, his face hardening because he did not like surprises when the fate of the realms was at stake, yet even he could see the logic now. Victor wanted grief to spread, but grief alone did not carve stone, guide runes, or open hidden paths. Someone had shown him where to dig, where to place the frost, and where to aim the blade. Edda stood slowly and said one name she had feared to speak. Vance. She told them that Vance was a broad-built warrior with white hair, dark icy armor, and glowing cold eyes, and that he carried a shattered frost shield that could turn sorrow into ice during battle. Long ago, Vance had been one of the bridge guardians near the shrine, and he had once protected travelers with calm strength. But after a deep loss of his own, he had become bitter and silent, and Victor had found that pain like a hunter finds dry wood. The two men had not just fought together. They had fed each other the worst parts of their grief until both of them became part of the curse. That truth changed the air between Thor and Loki. Thor had thought Victor was the lone enemy, easy to understand in the simple way of a battle line. Now he saw a wound inside the enemy, and that made the task harder. Loki saw something else as well. If Vance had helped, then there might be a way to pull him back before the cold took him fully. Loki did not say that out loud at first because he knew Thor would call it too risky. Instead, he pointed to a second set of marks in the stone. They were older than Victor's slash, and they were not made with the frost blade. They were forged signs, the kind used to bind and seal sacred heat. Edda went pale. She said those signs belonged to the old protective chambers under Asgard, places used to hide dangerous tools from greedy hands. That meant someone in the past had already feared this weapon, and someone had hidden answers here long before Victor came looking. The mystery had just grown deeper, and now the threat was not only a current attack, but an old secret waking up again. Before they could speak again, the chamber shook. A wave of cold hit the walls, and the frost on the floor rose into sharp white mist. From the far end of the tunnel came the sound of heavy steps, slow and certain. Freya arrived first, moving like a shield in human form, with golden hair tied back, bronze and steel armor bright even in the dark, and a red cloak thrown over one shoulder. She was the captain who guarded the bridge shrine, and she protected travelers from frost raids because that was her duty and her pride. Behind her came two shrine guards, both tired and shaken, their armor scratched from a recent clash near the outer road. Freya told them that Victor had pushed another frost wave toward the bridge, and that Vance had led it with a silence that felt worse than shouting. Several travelers had been forced to retreat, and the shrine gates had nearly locked under the pressure. The attack was spreading outward now, which meant the enemy was no longer hiding in one place. He was reaching for Asgard itself. Thor gripped the storm spear tighter, and blue lightning ran along its rune-forged shaft. He wanted to charge immediately, but Freya stopped him with a raised hand and a hard look. She said that blind force would only help Victor because the curse fed on panic, fear, and anger. That was when Loki stepped between them and spoke with unusual care. He said they needed to follow the hidden path under the chamber, find the source of the forged signs, and learn who had made the seals before the enemy did. If they could learn why the old protectors hid this chamber, they might also learn how to break the frost blade influence without destroying the tree. Thor did not like waiting, but he saw the truth in it. His trust in Loki was still new, still fragile, yet it had already saved him from making a mistake. So he nodded once, and that small motion meant more than a speech. They entered the narrow tunnel, with Edda lighting the way by pressing two charms together and waking a soft rune glow in the dark. The path sloped down under the roots, then opened into a hidden forge room carved from black stone. In its center stood a broken anvil and a ring of old silver lines, with frost packed into every corner. On the wall above the forge, Thor found a name cut into the stone in a style older than the current realm guards. It was not Victor. It was not Vance. It was his own father, Odin. The sight hit him harder than any blow because it showed that the hidden chamber had once belonged to the rulers of Asgard, and that the warning had been there all along. Edda read the marks aloud and said the chamber was built to hold a weapon too cold to be used near Yggdrasil. She said Odin had hidden it after learning that the blade did not just freeze flesh and stone, but also attacked the life force of the world tree itself. That was why the weapon had been forbidden. It had been made to turn pain into power, but its true cost was the slow death of everything it touched. Loki looked at Thor, and for once he did not hide behind a joke or a sharp phrase. He said the enemy was using sorrow like fuel because that was the only thing the blade could eat. Thor listened, and he finally understood why Victor had chosen such a cruel path. A man who believed the world had already taken everything from him would want everyone else to feel the same loss because that would make his pain feel justified. That did not make Victor less dangerous, but it did make him human, and that was important. Thor had spent too long thinking in straight lines of victory and defeat, of strength and weakness. Now he saw that this fight would need more than thunder. It would need patience, truth, and a way to break the cycle before it swallowed more of the realms. Then a low vibration rolled through the chamber, and every rune on the wall flashed pale blue. Edda stepped back in alarm and said the hidden forge was waking up. At the same moment, a voice echoed from the tunnel behind them, cold and calm. Victor had found them faster than expected, and he was not alone. The first shape to appear in the mist was Vance, broad and heavy in dark icy armor, his shattered frost shield bright with frozen cracks. His glowing cold eyes fixed on the group with a strange sadness, as if he already knew they had uncovered too much. Victor stood behind him in pale frost-marked armor, the forbidden blade in his hand, and his stern face showed no surprise at all. He had expected the truth to be found. He had simply reached it first. The chamber filled with cold so sharp that even Thor felt it bite through his armor. Loki shifted into a defensive stance, Freya raised her shield, and Edda pressed her charms together until the runes around the forge glowed brighter. Victor spoke first, and his voice was low enough to feel like ice sliding over stone. He said they had all been afraid to face what loss had made them into. He said Asgard had grown soft on hope and blind on comfort, and that the 9 realms would only understand pain if pain touched every root and bridge. Thor stepped forward and answered with thunder in his eyes, but before he could strike, Loki raised one hand and whispered that Vance was listening. That small warning froze the moment. Vance looked down at his shield, and for one brief second the cold in his face cracked. He was not fully gone. He was still trapped between Victor's promise and his own regret. Then the forge beneath them gave a deep groan, the hidden chamber walls began to split with pale light, and the next battle started to form around them like a storm. Thor tightened his grip on the storm spear, Loki read the room for one last opening, and Edda shouted that if the forge fully opened, the frost blade would gain even more power. The enemy had arrived, the secret had been exposed, and the future of Yggdrasil now hung on the choice made in the next breath. The hidden chamber under Niflheim glowed with thin pale light, and every crack in the stone looked alive. Cold wind pushed through the forge room in short, sharp bursts, while the air above the floor shimmered with frost and sparks at the same time. Thor stood in the center with his bright red hair wild around his face, his heavy gold and silver armor lit by blue lightning from the storm spear. Loki stayed one step behind him, slim and quick, his long black hair falling over dark green and black layers as his sharp eyes scanned every wall. Edda, the old rune keeper with white hair and a worn blue cloak, lifted one hand and pointed toward the widening split in the stone. She had spent her whole life reading sacred signs, and she knew this one meant danger. She said the forge was waking up fully, and if it opened all the way, the forbidden frost blade would drink the heat from the chamber and grow far stronger. That meant the threat was not only the enemy in front of them, but the whole structure beneath them. If the forge opened, the ice curse could spread from Niflheim into Asgard, then into the roots of Yggdrasil, and the 9 realms could slowly freeze from the inside. Thor felt the weight of that truth settle in his chest, because he had promised to protect the realms. Now that promise stood against a power that fed on pain itself. Then Victor stepped through the pale light, tall and stern in cold pale armor marked with frost scars. His gray hair framed a hard face, and the forbidden frost blade in his hand glowed like a shard of winter moonlight. He did not rush. He did not shout. He only looked at the heroes with a calm that made the room feel smaller. Beside him came Vance, broad and heavy in dark icy armor, his white hair bright against the cold, his broken frost shield hanging at his side. His glowing cold eyes told a simple truth. He had turned his sorrow into a weapon, and now he wanted the world to feel the same hurt he carried. Victor spoke first, saying the 9 realms had ignored the pain of Niflheim for too long, and that sharing suffering was the only fair answer. He believed that if every realm tasted the same cold grief, then no one could look away anymore. His voice was steady, but his motive was twisted by loss, because he thought mercy had only made the worlds weak and selfish. Thor saw the lie inside that logic. Pain shared by force was not justice. It was only another chain. Before Victor could raise the blade higher, Loki moved. He slid across the broken floor with almost no sound, and his careful smile returned for the first time in the room. Loki did not fight like Thor. He fought by seeing what other people missed. He noticed the runes on the forge wall, the frost marks on the floor, and the tiny pulse of heat inside the cracks. He understood that the forge was not only opening, it was reacting to emotion, and the frost blade was feeding on grief from every voice in the chamber. That was why Victor had brought it there, because the blade became stronger when sorrow filled the air. Loki darted forward and threw a small iron charm Edda had given him earlier. The charm struck the stone near the largest crack, and for one brief moment the pale light bent away. That was all Thor needed. He drove the storm spear into the floor, and thunder rolled through the chamber like a warning bell. Blue lightning burst along the runes, leaping across the broken stones and forcing the cold mist back. Victor staggered, not because he feared the blow, but because the forge itself answered Thor with an angry roar. The chamber shook, dust fell from the ceiling, the pale split in the wall widened another step. Edda shouted that the forge was not just a machine, but an old sacred gate tied to the roots of Yggdrasil. Long ago, she said, it had been sealed because smiths in Niflheim tried to bind grief into metal, and the result nearly cursed the world tree forever. That was the deeper danger. If the forge completed its opening, it would not simply make a stronger weapon. It would make the weapon part of the living system that held the realms together. Thor heard that and felt a chill far deeper than the room itself. His enemy was not only trying to win a battle. Victor was trying to change the rules of the world. Vance advanced first, lifting his shattered frost shield and sending a wave of cold across the floor. Ice spread in a hard line toward Thor, trying to pin his boots in place and slow his arm. Thor answered with a burst of thunder from the storm spear, breaking the ice before it could lock around him. The clash of storm and frost lit the chamber in white and blue flashes. Loki moved around the side, his dark clothes blending with the shadows as he raced toward the runic controls built into the far wall. He understood that if he could disrupt the forge pattern, he might stop the chamber from opening fully. But Victor saw the movement and reacted with cold precision. He raised the forbidden frost blade, and the weapon answered with a long, low cry that made the stone tremble. A curtain of ice shot across Loki's path and forced him to leap back, almost losing his footing. For one hard second, the heroes were split apart and the enemy held the center. That was when Freya arrived through a side passage, her golden hair shining under the pale glow, her bronze and steel armor scratched from battle, and her red cloak flaring behind her like a banner. She was the bridge shrine captain, brave and fast, and she had been guarding the travel routes above Asgard when the warning reached her. She mattered because she knew how to hold a line when stronger forces pushed in. She brought 2 shield guards with her, both grim and ready, and together they formed a wall at the chamber edge to keep the frost surge from spilling outward. Freya called out that the bridge shrine was already under pressure, and if this chamber burst open, the winter curse would have a direct path into the upper halls of Asgard. Her words made the stakes even sharper. This fight was no longer just about one room. It was about the roads, the bridges, the shrines, and the homes of thousands who had no idea how close the threat had come. Thor looked at Freya, then at Loki, then at Edda, and he understood that victory would require more than force. It would require trust. Edda stepped closer to the forge wall, despite the danger, and with calm hands she traced an ancient rune pattern in the air. Her voice stayed low and firm as she explained the final warning hidden in the old signs. The forge had 2 locks, one was stone and heat, the other was sorrow and choice. Victor had broken the first lock by bringing the blade, but the second lock was still alive, and it could only be closed by someone willing to carry grief without letting it rule them. Thor turned toward Victor and saw something new in the enemy for the first time. Under the cold armor and the hard voice, Victor was not just angry, he was exhausted. He had been carrying his pain so long that he had decided the world must carry it too. That truth did not excuse him, but it made him clearer to Thor. The enemy was trying to spread suffering because he had never found a better way to face his own. Thor tightened his grip on the storm spear and he made a choice of his own. He did not answer Victor with rage. He stepped forward with steady breath, planted his feet, and let the thunder in his weapon settle instead of explode. Then he spoke directly to Victor, saying that pain did not become lighter when it was forced on others. It only became larger and more broken. For a moment, the room went silent except for the crack of the forge and the low hum of frost magic. Victor hesitated, and that tiny pause changed everything. Loki saw it at once. He shouted for Edda to guide him, and together they began a quick and desperate plan. Loki would pull the rune lever at the far wall, Freya would hold the frost line, Thor would keep Victor from striking the chamber heart, and Edda would speak the closing sign before the forge opened any farther. It was a hard plan, and it depended on trust at full speed. Thor launched first, and the chamber answered with thunder. Freya clashed with Vance near the side wall, driving him back step by step with her shield and sharp footwork. Loki slipped under a burst of cold and reached the rune lever, but the wall shook so hard that his hand nearly missed it. Edda kept her eyes on the glowing split in the stone and spoke the sacred signs with full focus. Victor raised the frost blade high, and the room filled with a sharp white glare. Thor met him in the middle with the storm spear, and lightning hammered against ice as the hidden forge shook around them. The battle reached its highest point, and the pale light from the wall became so bright that every face looked carved from stone and fire. Then, deep inside the chamber, something answered. A second voice rose from the forge, not human, not fully cold, and not fully awake either. It was the old power of the sealed gate, stirred by the clash above it. The floor split another inch, and everyone realized the true danger had only just begun. The hidden forge trembled like a living thing, and cold light spilled across the broken floor in sharp white lines. Thor stood near the center with his storm spear held low, his bright red hair wild around his face, his heavy gold and silver armor marked by frost, and his dark cape snapping behind him like a warning flag. He was the protector of Asgard, and he knew this chamber mattered more than any battle above ground, because if the sealed gate opened here, the winter curse could climb straight into the roots of the world itself. Beside him, Loki moved with careful steps, his slim body turned sidewise so he could see every wall, every crack, and every enemy at once. His long black hair hung over his dark green and black layers, and his sharp eyes kept searching for the hidden truth that always sat behind the obvious danger. Edda, the old runekeeper, knelt near the split stone with her white hair tied back beneath a worn blue cloak, her leather straps and metal charms clinking softly as she studied the glowing signs. She had spent her life learning the warnings of sacred fire, and now her calm face had gone very still, because she knew the second voice in the forge was not a simple echo. Freya stood ready on the far side, tall and athletic, her golden hair shining under the pale light, her bronze and steel shield lifted in front of her red cloak. She guarded the bridge shrine and had come here to stop the frost raids before they reached the heart of Asgard. And between them and the growing crack stood Victor and Vance, the two enemies who had carried the curse here on purpose. Victor, tall and pale in cold armor marked with frost, held the forbidden frost blade with both hands, his stern face empty of mercy, his grief turned into a hard and cruel plan. Vance, broad and heavy in dark icy armor with white hair and shattered shield pieces still hanging from his arm, watched with glowing cold eyes, ready to push the chamber into collapse if Victor ordered it. They had both come for the same reason. Victor wanted his suffering to spread until every realm knew the same pain he had lost to, and Vance believed that only complete winter could wash the world clean. That was the true danger now, not only the fight in front of them, but the horrible idea that someone could use grief as a weapon and call it justice. Then the second voice rose again from deep inside the forge, and the whole chamber answered with a low groan. The wall of pale light shivered, the floor split wider, and a ring of frost raced across the stone toward everyone at once. Freya slammed her shield down and blocked the first wave, but the ice hit her with such force that she slid backward on her boots. Thor struck the ground with the storm spear, and blue lightning burst out in a wide line, shattering the nearest frost and forcing Vance to lift his shield and lean into the blast. Loki did not waste a second on power. He darted to the side, saw the pattern in the shaking rune lines, and shouted to Edda that the forge was not only reacting to the frost blade. It was waking because the battle had disturbed a seal that had been built long before any of them were born. Edda lifted her chin slowly, and her calm voice cut through the noise. She said the hidden forge had never been a simple workshop. It had been a prison door built under Yggdrasil to hold a forgotten power that fed on cold, fear, and broken promises. She had warned the council long ago that if the seal was struck too hard, the gate would listen. That was why the chamber had answered when the two forces collided. Victor heard her, and for the first time, something sharp moved across his face. He had known the forge was dangerous, but he had not understood that his blade was feeding something even older than his hate. Still, he tightened his grip and raised the forbidden frost blade higher. He said that if the world could not carry grief, then it deserved to freeze. His voice was steady, but it carried the sound of a man who had already chosen his pain over peace. Thor took a step forward, and the lightning around his spear grew brighter. He did not answer Victor with anger, because he could see the hurt hidden under the enemy armor, and that made the moment more dangerous, not less. He said that pain was real, but spreading it would not bring back what was gone, and it would only bury more people under Victor's sorrow. Victor laughed once, cold and short, and the sound had no joy in it at all. He said Thor spoke like someone who had never watched loss tear a home apart. Before Thor could answer, Vance slammed his shattered shield against the ground, and a jagged wall of ice rose between them. It cut the chamber in half and forced the heroes back as frost smoke filled the air. Freya moved first, running along the edge of the broken floor with her shield held tight, and she drove straight toward Vance to stop him from closing the route to the forge heart. The two of them crashed together in a hard clash of steel and ice, and Freya held her ground even as freezing force pushed against her arms. Loki slipped behind a fallen pillar, then reached toward the rune marks on the stone and traced their lines with 2 fingers. He saw something that made his careful smile vanish. The runes were not only sealing the gate, they were also binding it to the storm spear. The forge had chosen Thor as the one person strong enough to either keep it shut or force it fully awake. That was the twist hidden inside the chamber, and Loki understood it first. If Thor struck the wrong way, the old power below them would rise fast. If he held back, Victor and Vance might break the seal themselves. Loki looked toward Thor and shouted the truth across the noise, and Edda confirmed it at once with a single grave nod. The moment that truth was spoken, the chamber changed. The pale wall of light in front of them split open with a brighter pulse, and inside it, a shape began to move like a shadow trapped in ice. No one could see the whole form, but everyone could feel it. It was old, hungry, and awake enough to listen. The frost blade in Victor's hands started to shine on its own, answering the hidden power below. Victor froze for one stunned second because he finally understood that his weapon was not just a tool of revenge. It was a key. He had not only come to punish Asgard. He had been used by the deeper force in the forge to loosen the seal. That realization shook him harder than any blow. But instead of dropping the blade, he turned his grief inward and hardened around it, because a man like Victor did not let go easily. He shouted for Vance to push harder. Vance obeyed, and the ice around his boots spread across the floor in a fast, spreading wave that climbed toward Thor and Freya. Thor answered with a thunder strike that cracked the ice apart, but the force knocked him to one knee, and the chamber shook so violently that chunks of stone fell from the ceiling. Edda crawled toward the central rune circle, her worn blue cloak dragging over the dust, and she began to speak the old warning words in a low, steady voice. She was trying to calm the seal long enough for the others to act. Loki reached her side and helped clear broken stones away from the carved lines. Together they saw the last missing piece of the design. The forge could not be shut by force alone. It needed a choice, a true act of will, because the seal had been built to answer not only strength but intention. Thor heard that, and his face changed. He understood that his power was not enough by itself. He had to decide what he was protecting and why. That was the moment his anger began to turn into something deeper and stronger. He was no longer fighting just to win. He was fighting to keep the realms from becoming one long, frozen wound. Thor rose slowly, lifted the storm spear with both hands, and planted his feet against the shaking floor. Blue lightning climbed the weapon in bright branches, then wrapped around his arms and shoulders as he breathed in and held steady. Freya saw what he was doing and pressed Vance back with her shield, giving him space. Loki ducked under another burst of frost and called for everyone to stay clear of the central circle. Edda finished the warning line and then looked up at Thor with tired but certain eyes. She told him the seal would answer the truth of his heart. If he chose rage, the gate would open wider. If he chose protection, the forge might hold. Victor heard every word, and for one last moment his face almost cracked. He had wanted the world to share his grief, but now he saw a different path standing in front of him, and he hated that it was stronger than his anger. Still, he raised the frost blade one more time and sent a spear of cold toward the rune circle. Thor reacted at once. He drove the storm spear downward, and thunder exploded through the chamber in a wide flash that met the frost in midair. The collision filled the forge with blinding light, and the force drove Victor and Vance backward several steps. The split in the floor widened again, but this time the old power below did not surge forward. It hesitated, as if waiting to hear which side would speak last. Thor held the spear steady, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the crack, and he made his choice out loud. He said the realms would not be buried under fear, and he would not let grief become a chain for everyone else. The seal answered him. The light on the wall steadied for a single breath, and the shaking slowed just enough for the heroes to see what the forge was really becoming. Deep under the broken stone, behind the bright fracture, another shape of ice and ancient fire moved in the dark, and everyone understood that the true enemy had only begun to wake. Thor stood firm, Loki watched the shadows, Edda kept whispering the old rune words, and Freya held the line while Victor and Vance gathered themselves for the next strike. The chamber was not saved, and it was not lost either. It was balanced on the edge of something far worse, and the next choice would decide whether Asgard endured or fell into a winter older than memory itself. Deep below Asgard, the chamber glowed with broken light, and the air felt heavy with cold. Frost climbed over stone walls in thin white veins, while red fire pulsed near the floor like a warning heart. Above them, the sacred world tree Yggdrasil held the realms together, and every pulse from the chamber shook its roots with a slow, uneasy tremor. Thor stood in the center of that danger, a broad man with bright red hair, heavy gold and silver armor, and a dark cape that moved in the icy wind. He gripped the storm spear with both hands, and his stern face showed the burden of a protector who would not step away. Beside him, Loki, a slim man with long black hair and dark green and black layered clothing, watched the shadows with careful eyes and a quiet smile that never fully trusted the room. Edda, a calm elderly woman with white hair, worn blue cloak, and rune keeper straps covered in small metal charms, whispered old warning words as if the stone itself could still listen. Freya, an athletic woman with golden hair, bronze and steel shield captain armor, and a red cloak, held the broken line with a brave stare. Across from them, Victor, a tall man with gray hair, pale armor marked by frost, and a cold sword of forbidden ice, gathered his strength with a face full of grief. Near him, Vance, a broad man with white hair, dark icy armor, and a shattered frost shield, breathed in slow cold waves as if sorrow itself lived inside his lungs. Both villains wanted the same thing in different ways, and that made them more dangerous, not less. Victor wanted the realms to feel the same pain he carried, while Vance wanted that pain to harden into a kingdom of ice that no joy could ever melt. If they reached Yggdrasil with the frost blade, the roots could freeze, and once the roots failed, every realm would begin to fall apart. Edda was the first to understand what the chamber was becoming. She moved one careful step at a time, her charms clicking softly, and she pressed her hand to a rune carved into the floor. The mark burned under her palm, then flashed with a faint gold line that cut through the cold for a moment. Her eyes widened, not with fear alone, but with the kind of fear that came from knowing the truth too early. The fire below them was not ordinary fire, and the ice was not ordinary ice. They were old forge powers, stolen from a place older than memory, and they were waking because the frost blade had touched the root chambers beneath the hall. Edda turned her serious face toward Thor and said in a calm voice that still carried dread that the blade was not only freezing the tree. It was opening a path into the hidden forge heart of Niflheim, the frozen realm where forbidden magic had once been made. Loki narrowed his eyes at that because he understood the shape of a lie better than most people understood honesty. He saw at once that Victor and Vance did not simply want to destroy Asgard. They wanted to use the fear of destruction as a bridge, forcing the realms to bleed together through panic, loss, and frozen power. That meant this fight had changed, because the enemy was now trying to turn the chamber into a key. Freya raised her shield when the next tremor hit, and the impact sent bright sparks across the stone. A crack opened near the wall, and icy mist poured out with a low hiss. From that mist came more of the cold shapes that had been moving in the dark, their bodies formed from frost and old anger, driven by the energy of the frost blade. They did not charge like ordinary warriors. They spread out like a net, trying to wrap the chamber, slow the heroes, and push them away from the center where the runes glowed. Freya moved first, fast and clean, using her shield to block the front line and drive the shapes back without wasting a single motion. She was a bridge captain because she knew how to protect people while the world shook around them, and that skill mattered now more than ever. Thor answered with thunder, and blue lightning jumped from the storm spear into the stone floor, blasting a path through the frost mist and giving his allies one brief, clear lane. Loki used that opening at once. He slipped behind a fallen pillar, leaned low, and watched Victor instead of the ice shapes because the true threat was always the mind behind the weapon. Victor stood still, which made him even more dangerous. His pale eyes stayed fixed on Edda, as if he had already decided that her rune knowledge was the one thing that could stop him. Then he spoke with a flat voice, and for the first time his motive became clear to everyone in the room. Long ago he had lost his home to cold, hunger, and shame in Niflheim, and in his heart he had decided that every other realm must someday understand that same pain. He did not want peace, he wanted balance through suffering. He believed that if he could freeze Yggdrasil, then joy would end everywhere and no one would ever forget what he had lost. That terrible logic made the room feel even colder. Loki watched all of this and made a choice of his own. He knew brute force alone would not win the chamber because Victor and Vance were feeding the frost through hidden channels in the stone. So Loki moved where no one expected, crossing under broken beams and slipping into a narrow shadow between two rune columns. There he found the real answer waiting in plain sight, and it changed everything. The chamber had not been built only as a forge room, it had been built as a seal. The ancient fire and the old frost were not enemies by nature. They were two halves of a lock meant to keep a buried gate shut beneath Yggdrasil. Loki understood the meaning at once, and his sharp face hardened. Victor had not found the chamber by accident. He had followed the line of grief and frost to the one place where a broken heart could damage all the worlds at once. The hidden gate below them led toward the root into Niflheim, and if it opened fully, something sealed for ages could wake and spread its influence through the tree. Loki called this truth out to the others, and his voice cut through the battle like a blade of its own. Edda heard him and went pale, because she now understood why the old rune words kept repeating inside her mind. They were not just warnings, they were instructions for holding the seal together. Thor planted the storm spear into the floor and pushed thunder into the stone, trying to stabilize the chamber, while Freya forced the frost shapes away from Edda so she could speak the next words without breaking focus. For a moment the allies worked as one, and that unity gave them a thin chance. Then the greatest shock of the night arrived. Vance, who had seemed like Victor's heavy weapon, suddenly turned his glowing cold eyes toward Victor himself. The broad warrior lifted his shattered frost shield and spoke in a deep, rough voice that carried more pain than anger. He said that Victor wanted the realms to share his suffering, but Victor had forgotten one thing. Niflheim had already taken everything from Vance first, and Victor had never cared about the people who were crushed under the same grief. The truth slammed into the room with the force of a hammer. Vance had not followed Victor out of loyalty. He had followed him because he believed Victor could make the pain mean something. But now Vance saw that Victor wanted only control, not healing. The frost around Vance thickened, then cracked as his sorrow and doubt fought each other. Victor stared at him with hard eyes and warned him not to weaken now because the realm needed sacrifice. But Vance finally understood that sacrifice without mercy only creates more ruin. This was the turn that changed the battle because the enemy line broke from inside. Thor did not waste the moment. He charged forward with the storm spear blazing blue, and Freya rushed beside him with her shield raised high. Their attack did not strike to destroy, it struck to drive the enemy back and keep the seal from opening further. Edda raised both hands and finished the rune words with a clear voice, and the floor answered with gold light that wrapped around the frozen fire. Loki reached the hidden gate and found its lock point, a narrow crack where the old seal had weakened. He slipped a small rune charm into that crack, not with strength but with timing and trust. The chamber shuddered, the frost shapes collapsed into drifting mist, and Victor was forced to retreat several steps as thunder and rune light pushed his cold power back. Vance stumbled too, his shield shaking in his hands, his face torn between rage and shame. But the chamber did not heal, it only changed shape. Beneath the gold light, the floor opened just enough for all of them to see a deep line of ice running down into darkness, and that darkness was not empty. It breathed. From far below, through the roots of Yggdrasil, came a low sound like a sleeping giant turning in its rest. Edda whispered that this was older than the current war, older than the halls of Asgard, and older than the first oath of the gods. The seal had not held the buried force forever. It had only slowed it. Now Victor had cracked the outer lock, and the real danger had felt the touch of freedom. Thor held his spear tight and looked down into the opening with a grim face, knowing the next choice would matter even more than the last. Freya moved to his side and stood ready, her red cloak snapping in the cold wind, while Loki slipped back into the light with a careful glance at the dark below. Vance took one step away from Victor, not yet a friend and not yet an enemy, but no longer blind. Victor, still pale and cold, watched the opening with a rigid jaw and a look that mixed fury with obsession. He had wanted to force the worlds to share his pain, but now he saw a deeper prize beneath the roots, and that prize made him even more dangerous. The chamber had become a warning, a wound, and a doorway all at once. As the roots of Yggdrasil trembled overhead, the heroes understood that they had bought only a little time, and that the winter rising beneath Asgard was now awake enough to answer back. The chamber under Yggdrasil had gone silent for one hard breath, and that silence felt worse than noise. Frost still crawled over the roots like white veins, and cold light pulsed through the cracked floor in short, uneasy beats. Above them, the world tree trembled, not like a tree in the wind, but like a living thing that feared what had been found beneath it. Thor stood in the center of the chamber with his storm spear lowered, his bright red hair wild, his heavy gold and silver armor cracked with ice dust, and his dark cape hanging stiff behind him. He looked like a wall built to protect a kingdom. Beside him, Loki shifted his slim frame with careful steps, long black hair falling over dark green and black layers, his sharp eyes moving from Victor to the opening under the roots. Edda, the old rune keeper with white hair and a worn blue cloak, pressed one hand to the floor, reading the sacred signs with a calm face that hid deep worry. Freya, the shield captain with golden hair and bronze and steel armor under a red cloak, kept herself between the others and the widening frost. She guarded travelers in calmer days, but now she guarded the last path of Asgard itself. And across from them stood Victor, tall and pale in cold armor marked with frost, his stern face tight with grief and hunger. He had come here first to force the realms to feel his pain, but now his eyes shone with a worse idea. He had seen something deeper beneath the roots, and whatever he had seen had turned his sorrow into obsession. Victor lifted the forbidden frost blade in one steady hand, and the blade answered with a pale blue glow. Its ice runes were no longer quiet marks. They were waking lines, feeding on the cold around them and pulling strength from his broken heart. He spoke in a low voice that carried through the chamber. He said the world tree hid a buried core, an older power that could freeze every realm if awakened in the right way. He did not want simple revenge anymore. He wanted the whole world to understand the shape of his loss, to feel the same empty cold that had shaped his life. That was why he mattered, and that was why he was so dangerous. His grief had become a plan, and his plan had found a way into the roots of Yggdrasil. Edda looked up from the runes and finally gave the truth that made the chamber feel even smaller. Long ago, the forge signs warned that if a frost blade touched the deep root chamber while Yggdrasil was wounded, the tree would not just freeze on the outside. It would begin to sleep from within, and if that sleep spread too far, the 9 realms would lose their living link. Thor tightened his grip on the storm spear. He understood the stakes at once. If the tree failed, Asgard would lose its strength, its bridges would fail, and the winter curse would spread without limit. Then Vance stepped out from the far side of the broken opening, and the air turned colder at once. He was broad and heavy in dark, icy armor, with white hair, glowing cold eyes, and a shattered frost shield hanging in his grip like a broken promise. He did not rush forward like a wild brute. He came with the slow weight of a man who had already turned too much sorrow into ice and had learned to enjoy the power of it. He planted his feet and sent a wave of freezing force across the floor, forcing stone to hiss and crack. Freya blocked the blast with her shield, her red cloak snapping behind her as she slid back one step. Thor answered with a burst of thunder from the storm spear, and blue lightning smashed into the frozen wave, breaking it into shining fragments. Loki moved at the edge of the clash, not trying to overpower anyone but searching for the moment that mattered. He saw that Victor was no longer watching the heroes. Victor was watching the roots. His attention was fixed on a dark seam running beneath the opening, a hidden line in the sacred stone that only he had noticed. Loki understood the twist before the others did. Victor had not opened the chamber by accident. He had learned that the roots were built around a sealed forge path, and that path led toward a deeper chamber where forbidden cold could be shaped into something worse. Victor was not here simply to wound Asgard. He was here to claim the heart of its buried power. Edda spoke again, faster now, and her calm voice became a warning. She said the ancient forge signs had never been meant as decoration. They were locks. They were meant to keep a hidden chamber asleep, because the chamber below the roots could strengthen either fire or frost, depending on who reached it first. That was the real reason the old warnings had mattered. The gods had feared greed, but they had feared grief even more, because grief could make a person willing to ruin everything just to prove a feeling was real. Thor looked toward the seam in the stone and saw thin frost lines spreading from Victor through the floor, almost like fingers searching for a latch. He realized then that Victor had not come alone with anger. He had brought a method. The forbidden frost blade was not only a weapon. It was a key, and every strike of cold was helping it fit the lock beneath Yggdrasil. The chamber began to shake again, and dust fell in silver threads from the roots above. Far away, through the tunnel behind them, the sound of alarm horns rose from Asgard. Freya turned her head at once. She knew those horns meant the bridge shrine had seen movement, and if the bridge fell, travelers and messengers would be cut off from the high halls. That would turn a bad crisis into a realm-wide trap. She wanted to run there, and Thor wanted to stop Victor, and both needs were true. But Loki, with his careful mind, saw the worst truth. If Victor opened the deeper chamber now, the frost curse would spread faster than any alarm could travel. So they moved together not as separate warriors, but as one hard team trying to hold a broken line. Freya led the first push, bronze shield raised, red cloak flashing as she drove toward Vance. Vance met her with icy strength, and their clash sent a ring of cold across the stone. She did not win by force alone. She forced him to step wrong, then shoved his shield aside and opened a path. Thor followed through that path with thunder gathering around his spear, each step hammering the floor like a drum of war. He struck the edge of Victor with a burst of lightning that threw sparks across the chamber, and Victor staggered only once before he answered with a blade sweep of pale frost that numbed the air around Thor's armor. Loki slipped past both fighters, ducking low under a broken root, and he moved toward the seam in the stone with the speed of a thought. He had no desire to stand in the center of the clash. He wanted the hidden truth because knowledge could break what strength could not. Edda stayed near the roots, tracing runes in the air with shaking fingers, and each sign she marked steadied the chamber for one brief moment. Her magic did not smash enemies. It held space together long enough for others to act. That was her role, and she mattered because without her, the world tree might have cracked open then and there. Loki reached the seam, and what he saw made him stop for the first time. The stone beneath the roots was not natural stone at all. It was a sealed forge door, old as the first oath of Asgard, hidden under layers of root growth and frost scars. Along its edge were two missing rune slots, one shaped for storm, one shaped for winter. The twist became clear in a single sharp moment. The chamber did not open because Victor had won. It opened because the old locks had been designed to respond to both power and pain. The deeper chamber could be opened only when a storm bearer and a frost bearer fought above it, because long ago the builders had feared exactly this kind of corruption. Someone had built a trap to keep greedy hands away, but that same trap now made the danger worse. Victor understood that too, and for the first time his cold face changed. He had thought he was forcing the realms to share his pain, but now he saw a prize hidden below the roots that could make his grief eternal and make the curse permanent. That thought made him more dangerous, not less. He turned toward the hidden door, raised the frost blade, and the runes on its edge began to pulse in time with the root tremors. Thor saw the motion and knew he had only a moment. He could not let the blade touch the seal. He threw himself forward, thunder building in his arm, and Loki shouted for Edda and Freya to brace the chamber. The storm spear struck the frost blade in a flash of blue and white light, and the impact shook the whole root hall. The sound was like a mountain splitting, but no one fell. Freya drove her shield into Vance and forced him back from the seal. Edda slammed both palms onto the rune floor and spoke the oldest warning she knew, a lock phrase meant to hold sacred doors shut. For one long second the chamber held. Then Victor, with a face full of anger and wonder, dragged the frost blade across the hidden seal and sent a sharp line of ice into the rune door. The chamber answered with a deep groan, and a narrow opening appeared under the roots, black and cold and far larger than any of them had expected. A breath of ancient winter rose from below, and even Thor felt it bite into the heat around his blood. Inside that opening they did not see treasure, and they did not see a simple weapon. They saw the edge of a deeper forge hall, lined with frozen pillars and faint blue fire, a place where the cold itself seemed to think. Victor smiled for the first time, and it was not a kind smile. It was the look of a man who had found a way to make the world suffer with him, but he had not entered yet. He had only opened the next door. Thor planted his spear, caught his balance, and raised his eyes with a new hard focus. He knew the fight had changed. They were no longer defending one chamber. They were racing against a hidden winter under Asgard, and that winter had just learned their names. The roots above them trembled again, the horns of Asgard sounded closer, and the heroes prepared to follow Victor into the dark opening beneath Yggdrasil, where the next truth waited, cold and awake. The roots of Yggdrasil shuddered above them, and the air inside the hidden passage turned sharp and raw. Cold mist drifted along the stone floor, and every breath carried the taste of old frost and buried stone. Thor stood at the front with his storm spear planted hard beside him, his bright red hair falling over heavy gold and silver armor, while his dark cape moved in the strange wind that rose from below. His face was set with a fierce, steady look, because he now understood the truth that mattered most. This was no longer a fight for one chamber under Asgard. This was a race against a winter that was spreading through the living roots of the world tree, and if it reached the heart, the 9 realms would feel it all. Behind him, Loki watched with narrow eyes and a careful smile, his long black hair framing his slim face, his dark green and black clothing moving with each quick breath. He wanted answers more than glory, and his mind was already searching for the next trick hidden in the dark. Edda, the old rune keeper with white hair and a worn blue cloak, stepped closer to the door Victor had opened. Her calm face did not hide her fear, but it did show her resolve. She knew the sacred signs of the forge, and she knew when a warning was not a warning anymore, but a final chance. Freya stood near the bridge shrine behind them, golden hair bright even in the cold, her polished bronze and steel armor catching the light, her red cloak hanging still. She had guarded travelers from frost raids for many seasons, and she would not let Asgard fall while she still had strength in her arms. And Victor was ahead in the dark, tall and hard in cold pale armor marked with frost, his gray hair pale as ash, his face fixed in a stern mask that hid too much pain. He carried the forbidden frost blade from Niflheim, and every step of his had one cruel purpose. He wanted the realms to suffer with him because grief had hollowed him out, and he had turned that wound into a weapon. That was the true danger now, not only the blade but the broken heart that guided it. Thor moved first, and the others followed into the narrow opening beneath the roots. The passage was made of black stone and frozen rootwood, with old rune marks pressed into the walls like scars from a forgotten age. Edda touched the nearest mark with 2 fingers, and her eyes widened as she read the warning. She said the root chambers were built long before the high halls of Asgard, when the first keepers learned that some winters could think, wait, and hunt. Loki tilted his head and asked what that meant, but Edda only pointed ahead and told them the cold was not natural. It was being fed. It needed sorrow, fear, and regret, just like a fire needed wood. That was why Victor was moving so fast. The blade in his hand could not grow on its own. It drank pain, and the deeper Victor sank into his own grief, the stronger the blade became. Thor tightened his grip on the storm spear, and blue lightning flickered along the weapon in thin, bright lines. He did not speak at first, because he was listening to the stone. Beneath the silence he could hear a low pulse, like a heartbeat buried in ice. Freya ran her hand along the wall and found fresh frost spreading between the runes, so fast that it looked like white veins crawling through the rock. She warned that Victor was not just running, he was opening something. Then the passage widened into a lower root hall, and there they saw the first true sign of the hidden winter. A circle of broken stone stood in the center of the chamber, and inside it lay a pool of pale ice that glowed from within. The ice was not still. It moved in thin waves as if something under it was trying to rise. Thor stared at the pool, and the hard focus in his eyes sharpened into anger. Loki whispered that Victor had found an old root seal and was tearing it apart from the inside. Edda nodded once and said the seal was made to trap a frost spirit from Niflheim, a thing born from endless cold and bitter memory. If the seal broke fully, the spirit would travel through the roots and spread winter into every realm that Yggdrasil held. That meant Asgard would not simply become cold, it would begin to fail from the inside, branch by branch, gate by gate. The stakes were now plain to everyone. If they failed here, no bridge, no hall, and no shrine would stay safe. Thor stepped toward the circle, but before he could reach it, the chamber trembled hard and a sharp crack split the floor behind them. A wall of frost surged up from the stone, and from it stepped Vance, broad and heavy in dark icy armor, his white hair hanging wet against his face, his glowing cold eyes fixed on the heroes with grim purpose. He carried a shattered frost shield on one arm, and the broken edges glittered like sharp glass. He did not speak with joy or rage. He spoke with the tired weight of someone who had made a terrible choice and still believed it had to be carried through. He said Victor was right about one thing. Pain did not stay buried forever. It spread, and only strong cold could make the world honest. Then he raised the shield, and a wave of freezing force slammed through the chamber, forcing the heroes back in a burst of white mist and stone dust. The clash was fast, harsh, and close. Thor drove forward through the blast, his storm spear throwing lightning into the frost wall and splitting it in bright blue cracks. Freya rushed to his side with her shield up, her movements sharp and trained, and she held the line long enough for Loki to dart around the edge of the chamber. Loki moved like a shadow with a heartbeat, sliding between broken stones and slipping past Vance with a quick feint that turned the frost warrior for one breath. Edda stayed near the rune circle because she alone could see that the ice pool was growing larger every second. She called out that the seal was tied to Victor, and if his grief deepened any further, the cold would answer him faster. Thor understood then that Victor had chosen this chamber because it was close to the root heart, the place where sacred power flowed strongest. He was not only trying to hide, he was trying to use the old power of Asgard to feed his curse. Vance attacked again, swinging the shattered shield with brute force and driving Freya to one knee, but she held firm and pushed him back with a hard shield strike to his center. Thor thundered the ground with the butt of his spear, and the shock sent a crack through the frost layer under Vance. Loki seized that opening, yanked a rune chain from the wall, and wrapped it around the broken shield arm just long enough to slow the frost warrior down. But Vance was strong, and his cold power burst outward in jagged waves. The chamber chilled so fast that the heroes could see their own breath turn thick and white. Then, just as the fight looked ready to swallow them, Victor appeared beyond the ice pool, half-turned in the glow of the dark opening ahead. He had not come to help Vance, he had come to witness them. His stern face showed no surprise, only the quiet certainty of a man walking toward a choice he had already made. He said Thor could strike him down 100 times in spirit, but it would not bring back what Niflheim had taken from him. The realms had enjoyed their warmth, their peace, their bright halls, while others froze and suffered. Now every realm would understand. Thor raised the storm spear and roared that Victor was wrong, but Edda suddenly shouted for everyone to stop because the frost pattern in the chamber had changed. The runes on the floor were not only a seal. They were a map, and the map was pointing deeper below the root heart to a second chamber that none of them knew existed. Victor heard her, and for the first time his stern face tightened. He had not expected anyone to see it so quickly. That was the first true twist in the dark under Asgard. The hidden winter was not only a curse. It was part of a larger plan buried beneath the world tree, and Victor was not the only one trying to reach it. The chamber shook again, harder this time, and the ice pool split down the middle with a long, bright crack. A column of cold mist rose from it, and in the center of that mist a narrow stairway appeared, cut into the root stone and descending into blackness. Even Vance stepped back from the sight, because whatever waited below had awakened fully. Edda stared at the stairway and said it was an old forge path, sealed after a failed attempt to bind frost magic inside the roots of Yggdrasil. She remembered the sacred warning from her teachers. If the forge path was ever opened again, it would not bring a weapon. It would bring a choice. Thor looked at the stairway, then at the shaking walls, then at the faces of his friends. He could feel the weight of Asgard above him, every hall and tower resting on the same living tree that now trembled in fear. For the first time in the long fight, he also felt something else. He felt that simple anger was not enough. Victor was not only an enemy to strike. He was a broken man who had turned pain into purpose, and that made him dangerous in a deeper way. Thor would have to protect the realms without letting hatred harden his own heart. Loki saw the change in Thor before anyone else did. The slim trickster gave a small nod, not because he agreed with Victor, but because he understood how close the dark path could come to the brave. Freya placed her shield against her side and said they could still stop this if they moved fast. Vance, now forced back by the broken runes and the spear glow, glared at Victor as if he too had just learned that he was not standing at the center of the plan. Victor had gone far enough to wake something beneath the root heart, and that something was now reaching up through the stairs with a hunger of its own. The cold in the room became so still that it felt alive. Thor lifted his spear and lightning climbed the shaft in bright threads. He told the others to stay close. Then he stepped toward the stairway, knowing the next truth waited below, cold and awake, and knowing that the battle for Asgard had only just reached its darkest depth. The stairway below Asgard was narrow, steep, and carved from old stone that had seen too many winters. Cold air rose from the dark below, and it moved in slow waves as if something alive was breathing through the cracks. Thor stood at the front with his storm spear in both hands, his bright red hair pushed back by the chill, his heavy gold and silver armor shining under the weak light. Behind him stood Loki, slim and careful, with long black hair and dark green and black clothing that let him move like a shadow. Edda, the old rune keeper, kept one white hand on the wall, her white hair trembling slightly under her worn blue cloak. Freya, with her golden hair and bronze shield armor, stayed near the others, ready to block any strike. Victor waited below with a cold face and gray hair, his pale armor marked by frost, while Vance stood near him, broad and silent, his white hair hanging over his dark icy armor. The danger was plain now. Victor had awakened something under the root heart of Yggdrasil, and if that thing reached the upper halls, the sacred tree could freeze from the inside out, taking Asgard and every connected realm with it. Thor moved first. He placed one heavy boot on the upper step and let lightning run along the spear in bright blue threads, not as a display, but as a warning. The cold below pressed against him, trying to slow his breath and stiffen his arms, yet he kept going because the others were counting on him. Loki leaned close and whispered that the stairway felt wrong, as if the stone had changed shape when nobody was watching. Edda answered in a calm voice that the old forge signs on the walls were no longer simple warnings. They were lock marks built to keep a sleeping force sealed beneath the roots. She explained that the force below was not a mindless storm. It had been fed by grief, fed by fear, and fed by Victor until it began to answer him. That was why the cold had become so still. It was listening. They descended one level and the air grew heavier. The walls narrowed and white frost spread in thin veins across the stone. Freya raised her shield when a burst of icy force snapped from below, striking the steps and blasting powdered stone into the air. Thor drove the spear into the ground, and the lightning from its head pushed the cold back in a bright, crackling line. A low sound rolled up from the dark, not a voice and not a growl, but something deeper, like a huge door opening inside a frozen mountain. Vance appeared on the lower landing then, his broad frame blocking the path, his glowing eyes fixed on Thor with a look that held sorrow and stubborn rage together. He told Thor that the realms had ignored pain for too long, and that winter would make everyone share it at last. Thor answered that pain did not give anyone the right to ruin the world. Vance only tightened his grip, and frost gathered around his shattered shield like broken glass waiting to be thrown. Then Loki saw the first clear lie in Victor. Victor had not only awakened the thing below, he had also been using it to draw strength from Asgard itself. The old frost blade in his hand was not just a weapon. It was a key, and every time he lowered it toward the roots, it pulled more cold from Niflheim into the sacred tree. That meant the danger was not just a creature in the dark. It was a chain between worlds, and Victor had chosen to fasten it because he believed grief had made him wise. Edda looked at the walls again and realized the last seal was not broken by force. It had been opened from the wrong side by someone who knew the old runes. She turned sharply toward Victor and demanded the truth. Victor, still cold and proud, said he had once tried mercy, and mercy had given him nothing but loss. Now he wanted every realm to feel what he had felt, because in his mind shared suffering was the only honest peace. The room grew so still that even the torch flames seemed afraid. Thor kept moving down while the others held the landing behind him. The stairway opened into a vast chamber beneath the roots, and their Yggdrasil could be seen from the inside, a giant living wall of glowing bark and frozen veins, with root lines twisting overhead like the ribs of a sleeping giant. In the center of that chamber sat a black pool of frost, and from that pool rose a shape that had no clear body yet, only an outline made of white cold and drifting shards. It reached upward whenever Victor spoke, as if his grief were a hand guiding it. Thor felt the truth hit him hard. The thing was not simply waking, it was learning. It was feeding on every bitter thought in the chamber, and Victor had become its voice. Freya pushed forward to protect the group, but Vance slammed his shield against the floor and sent a wave of ice across the chamber, forcing everyone back. Loki moved fast, slipping behind a stone pillar to avoid the wave, and Edda shouted for Thor to strike the frost blade, not the creature, because the blade was the bond holding the whole curse together. Thor understood at once, but before he could act, Victor lifted the forbidden frost blade with both hands and drove it into the root stone at the chamber's center. The impact did not break the floor, it opened it. A deep pulse rolled through Yggdrasil, and a hidden voice rose from beneath the roots, cold and ancient, saying that the realm door was nearly ready. Thor felt the chamber shake, and he knew this was the darkest turn yet. If that door opened, the winter curse would not stop at Asgard. It would spread through every connected realm and lock the living world inside endless cold. Thor lowered his stance, lightning building along the spear until his armor glowed blue and gold. Loki shouted for everyone to split apart. Freya shielded Edda and forced her back from the crack in the floor. Vance stepped forward to hold the line. Victor watched with grim satisfaction, and the cold shape below began to rise higher, reaching toward the light as the battle dropped deeper into the heart of the tree, with no safe path left and no time left to waste. The heart of Yggdrasil trembled like a living drum, and the cold light inside its roots made every face look pale and tense. Thick roots arched above the group like broken bridges, while frost crawled over the bark in slow white lines. Below them, the deep crack in the floor widened with a low groan, and the air itself seemed to tighten around the warriors. This was no ordinary battlefield anymore. This was the living center of the 9 realms, and if the frost curse spread much farther, Asgard would lose its warmth, the bridge shrines would fail, and the whole world tree could fall into endless winter. Thor stood in the middle of that ruin with his storm spear ready, his bright red hair wild around his hard face, his heavy gold and silver armor shining in blue lightning. He was the guardian who refused to step back because he knew that if he failed here, every realm would suffer. Beside him, Loki moved with quick, careful steps, his long black hair falling over dark green and black clothing, his sharp eyes watching every shift in the ice. Loki wanted one thing above all in this moment, and that was survival through smart choices, because he knew brute force alone would not save them. Freya kept her bronze and steel shield lifted in front of Edda, her golden hair tied back and her red cloak dragging through the frost dust, her brave face locked in focus. Freya protected travelers and fighters alike, and she mattered here because she understood that a shield could save a life faster than any speech. Edda, the old rune keeper with white hair and a worn blue cloak, pressed one hand against the tree bark as if she could hear it speak. She was calm, but her serious eyes held deep fear, because she understood the sacred warnings hidden in the ancient forge signs. Vance stood near the broken edge, broad and heavy in dark icy armor, his white hair bright against the cold glow of his eyes. He held a shattered frost shield and carried the painful need to turn his own sorrow into power, which made him dangerous even when he did not mean to be. And there, just beyond the shifting mist, Victor watched with a stern face and cold, pale armor marked with frost lines, his gray hair damp with white crystals. He had dragged the forbidden frost blade from Niflheim into this sacred place, and he wanted all realms to feel his misery so no one could stay warm while he suffered. That was the true conflict now. Victor did not just want victory. He wanted the world to share his grief, and the blade in his hand was built to feed that hunger. Loki broke the stillness first. He shouted for everyone to split apart, and his voice snapped through the chamber like a thrown knife. Thor moved at once, driving his boots across the shaking floor as the lightning in his spear flared brighter. Freya pulled Edda back from the crack in the floor, and the old woman stumbled only once before she found her balance. Vance stepped forward with his shattered shield raised high, and the icy glow around him grew stronger as he prepared to hold the line. Then the shape below rose again. It was not a person, and it was not a beast in any simple way. It looked like a mass of frozen force wrapped in dark frost, a thing pulled upward by the curse itself. Its pale outline pushed closer to the opening, and the cold around it became so sharp that even the air felt brittle. Edda stared at it with wide, steady eyes, and then her face changed as she finally understood the warning she had been fearing. The frost blade was not only freezing the roots. It was waking an old wound inside Yggdrasil, a wound that had been sealed long ago because it could call cold from Niflheim straight into the heart of the tree. That was why the ancient rune signs mattered. That was why the forge warnings had been passed down with such care. If the blade reached full power here, it could lock the living roots in place and stop the flow of life through the 9 realms. Edda shouted the truth over the cracking ice, telling Thor that the tree was not just being attacked. It was being chained from within. Thor heard her clearly, and the weight of that truth hit him harder than any blow. He had expected a battle, but now he saw a worse danger. Victor was not only trying to win, he was trying to force the world tree to carry his pain forever, and that would turn grief into a prison for everyone. Thor planted the storm spear into the floor, and blue lightning burst along the roots like a fast river of light. The thunder did not shatter the tree, it woke it. Bark lines glowed gold under the frost, and the chamber answered with a deep living pulse. Loki caught that pulse at once and darted around the broken ground, using the bright flash to confuse Victor and draw the cold shadows away from Freya and Edda. Freya pushed Edda behind a thicker root and struck her shield against an incoming wave of frost, forcing it back in a spray of ice dust. Vance met the colder surge head-on, and his dark armor locked into a hard wall of ice, taking the force so the others would not be overwhelmed. He was still on Victor's side in body, but not fully in mind, and that split made him dangerous in a far deeper way than simple rage. Victor saw that Thor had touched the tree awake, and his face tightened with anger. He lifted the forbidden blade and called out that the realms had ignored pain for too long, that warmth had made them weak, and that only shared suffering could bring balance. His words were cold, but they came from a real wound. Long ago, Niflheim had taken something precious from him, and instead of healing, he had chosen revenge. He believed that if everyone froze a little, then no one would ever laugh at pain again. That belief made him relentless, and that was why he kept fighting even as the roots around him glowed brighter under Thor's power. The chamber shook harder when the cold shape below pushed one arm through the opening. It was huge, jagged, and covered in pale frost runes that crawled like living scratches across the surface. The thing reached upward, not toward Thor, but toward the storm light itself, as if it wanted to swallow the thunder and silence it forever. Loki saw the danger and realized the truth first. Victor was not fully controlling the thing below. He had awakened something older, and now the curse was starting to answer its own hunger. That was the twist hidden in the heart of the battle. Victor had come to rule through frost, but the blade he carried was also unlocking a deeper force buried in the tree, a force that could escape him if it was fed too much fear. Loki shouted the warning, and everyone turned at once. Thor did not hesitate. He drove forward across the cracked floor, lightning racing from his armor into the spear, and he swung at the rising frost shape with a powerful strike that split the frozen mist in two. The impact did not destroy it, but it forced the creature back long enough for Freya to pull Edda farther from the edge. Edda then pressed her hand against a glowing rune on the root wall, and she began to speak the old forge signs in a low, steady voice. Her words were not a spell in the simple sense. They were a command given to the sacred tree itself, reminding it what it had been built to do. She told the roots to remember warmth, to remember growth, and to remember the first oath that bound the realms together. The bark answered with a golden pulse, and a thin line of frost cracked away from the center wall. Victor flinched when he felt that change. He had expected fear. He had not expected the tree to listen to Edda. He turned his blade toward her and Vance moved first, stepping in front of the old woman with his shattered shield raised. Their icy powers clashed in a burst of white sparks, and Vance was driven back one step, then another, until his boots scraped the frozen floor. He gritted his teeth, and for one brief moment his stern face showed doubt. He had followed Victor because he believed suffering should have meaning, but here he saw that pain could also be used to protect, not just to break. Freya saw that doubt and she shouted his name with fierce clarity, telling him that he was still choosing every second he stood there. That hit him harder than Thor hammering the roots because it gave him a chance to turn around. The chamber split with another violent pulse from below, and the frost shape reached higher, now large enough for everyone to see the hollow light burning inside its chest. Thor understood then that they had only one real chance. They had to keep the curse from climbing any higher while Edda finished the rune command and Loki found a way to cut Victor away from the blade. Yet the floor beneath them was dropping into deeper cracks, and the path behind them was almost gone. Thor lifted his head, thunder rolling through his armor, and he called for the others to trust him one more time. Loki gave a quick nod and vanished into the broken shadows. Freya locked her shield and stepped beside Edda. Vance tightened his grip and stared at his own shaking hand, unsure whether he would stand with Victor or against him in the next breath. Victor, seeing the circle closing around him, only smiled that cold, thin smile of his, because he still believed this suffering could be forced into a new shape. Above them, the branches of Yggdrasil groaned, and the storm light and frost light began to collide like two worlds pressing against one another. The battle had reached a point where every choice would change the next one, and no one in that frozen heart could afford to look away. Then the tree spoke in another way. A deep golden shimmer ran through the bark near Edda's hand, and a hidden path opened between two massive roots just wide enough for one person at a time. Edda did not look surprised, but she did look troubled, because she knew that old paths only opened when the tree was warning its protectors about a greater danger ahead. The new opening led downward, deeper into the heart of the roots, where the cold light was thickest and the air smelled like snow buried for too long. Thor understood at once that this was not a rescue. It was a challenge. Something below had noticed their resistance, and now it was calling them closer. Loki returned from the shadows at that exact moment, his dark eyes sharp and fast, and he said that Victor had left a trail through the broken frost that led toward the new opening. That meant Victor knew more than he had admitted, and it also meant he had been guiding the group toward this place from the start. The revelation settled hard over the others. Victor had not simply stumbled into the hidden heart of Yggdrasil. He had come because he believed the tree held a way to make his curse permanent, and perhaps even make it spread beyond Asgard. That made the fight larger than any of them had first guessed. Freya tightened her grip on her shield, Edda leaned on the glowing root wall, and Vance looked down the open path with a face full of conflict. Thor stepped to the front, the storm spear blazing with blue-gold power, and he said nothing for a moment. He was no longer thinking only like a warrior. He was thinking like a protector who had finally learned that strength without trust was not enough. He looked at Loki, Freya, Edda, and even Vance, and he understood that he could not carry the whole burden alone. The others saw that change in him too. Loki gave a small, careful smile because he knew that Thor had finally accepted the shape of true leadership. But Victor was still there, still holding the frost blade, still feeding on the cold around him, and the hidden path ahead promised answers that none of them were ready to face. So Thor raised his spear toward the opening, lightning filling the dark chamber, and the group prepared to move deeper into the living roots of Yggdrasil, where the next truth waited in the cold. The hidden root path opened like a wound in the heart of the tree, and cold air rushed out in a hard, low breath. Thor stood at the front, tall and wide, with bright red hair and armor that caught every flash of blue lightning from his storm spear. Behind him waited Loki, slim and careful, with long black hair and dark green and black clothes that made him hard to see in the shadows. Edda followed close behind, an old woman with white hair, a worn blue cloak, and rune keeper straps covered in small metal charms. Freya came next, a brave woman with golden hair, bronze and steel shield armor, and a red cloak that moved like fire in the dim light. Victor stayed near the back, a tall man with gray hair, cold pale armor, and the forbidden frost blade held low in his hand, while Vance hovered near him. A broad man with white hair, dark icy armor, and a shattered frost shield that looked like it had already seen too many battles. All of them knew the same hard truth now. If the frost curse inside Yggdrasil was not stopped soon, it would spread farther into Asgard, then into every realm linked by the sacred roots, and no wall would hold it back. Thor lowered his spear just enough to let the lightning soften, and he looked at the narrow opening ahead with a leader long before him. He had once thought strength meant pushing forward no matter what, but the last battles had changed him. He had seen that raw force could break stone, yet it could not always break fear, grief, or lies. Loki noticed that change at once, and his careful smile showed that he understood more than anyone else in the chamber. He did not trust Victor, but he trusted Thor to keep moving without losing himself. Edda touched the bark wall with 2 fingers, read the glowing runes carved into the wood, and spoke in a calm voice that made the others listen. She said the path was old, older than the bridge shrine, older than the forged temples of Asgard, and it was built to protect a secret that the realm gods feared to name. Freya turned her head at that because she had spent her life guarding travelers from frost raids, and she knew that secrets often hid the most dangerous threats. Victor only watched the opening with hard eyes. He wanted the truth because he believed the truth would justify his pain. He had lost too much in the cold of Niflheim, and he was done waiting for mercy from a world that had never given him enough. He believed that if all the realms could feel the same freezing misery, then no one would ever ignore suffering again. Thor stepped into the hidden path first, and the rest followed into a tight tunnel of giant roots. The chamber behind them faded, while the air ahead grew darker and colder, and the bark around them shone with thin lines of pale gold. The roots were alive, but they were hurt. Frost crept over them in slow waves, as if something beneath the tree was breathing cold into the wood. Every few steps, the group passed broken rune marks and old warning signs pressed into the living walls. Edda explained that these marks were forged by the first keepers of Yggdrasil, who had sealed away a deep winter source long ago because it fed on sorrow and turned it into power. That was why the frost blade of Victor was so dangerous. It did not simply freeze flesh or stone. It drank grief, fear, and regret, then made them stronger. The more Victor used it, the more it linked to the frozen wound buried in the tree. Thor tightened his grip on the storm spear and understood the trap. Victor was not just attacking the realms from outside, he was helping awaken something already hidden inside the world tree itself. That thought made the chamber feel smaller, because it meant the real enemy was not only a man, but an old wound that had never fully healed. They moved deeper, and then the roots opened into a larger room with cracked bark walls and glowing rune lines running across the floor. In the middle of that room, a strange frost shape swelled up from beneath the ground. It was unstable and pale, with a shifting outline that looked almost human, and a bright cold light pulsed in its center like a cold heart trying to wake. Freya raised her shield at once because she was trained to protect the weak point before danger could spread. Loki darted to the side, his long black hair brushing his collar as he checked the high roots and the dark corners for an ambush. Vance stepped forward with a heavy stance, and the cold in his eyes deepened as he pushed his own freezing power into the chamber, trying to strengthen the frost shape. Victor lifted his frost blade and fed the curse with a steady hand, and the room answered with a sharp crack of ice along the bark walls. He then spoke the part of his motive that made the others finally understand him more clearly. He said the realms had always broken the weak, ignored the broken, and called it order. He had watched Niflheim suffer in silence while Asgard stayed bright and proud. He no longer wanted peace built on forgetting. He wanted a cold so wide that every realm would finally know what pain felt like. Thor answered him with thunder in his voice, but not with anger alone. He said suffering did not become fair just because everyone shared it. Edda agreed in a firm voice, adding that a wound spread through all the realms would only make more wounds. Yet Victor did not move. He looked at the frost shape below the floor, and for the first time his stern face showed something close to fear. That was when the first true revelation struck them. The frost shape was not only a weapon, it was a seal. Edda read the ancient rune line along the floor and saw the hidden meaning the others had missed. Long ago, the keepers of Yggdrasil had used sorrow itself to lock away a buried passage to Niflheim, because the ice realm had once tried to force its way into the root core and poison the tree from below. The frost curse was not a random attack, it was a key. Victor had thought he was opening a road to justice, but he was really cracking open a prison that held back a far older winter than himself. Loki immediately understood the danger and looked at Victor with sharp eyes. He said the frost blade had been chosen, not just wielded. Someone or something had guided Victor toward this hidden path by using his grief. Victor froze for a single breath, and that pause said more than any shout could have said. He realized he had not found the blade by accident. He had been led. The curse had used his pain as a door. Vance, still loyal to the cold, hesitated as well, because even he could feel that the power under the floor was bigger than his own anger. Thor stepped closer, spear raised, and ordered everyone to hold the chamber steady while he sealed the opening before it could widen. But the frost shape below suddenly surged upward, and the whole room shook as cold light burst through the rune lines. The clash came fast, but it stayed clean and sharp like blades of light against ice. Thor drove his storm spear into the floor, and blue lightning raced through the glowing runes, trying to pin the frost shape back into the seal. Freya locked her shield into place and pushed against the spreading cold, keeping the smaller roots from cracking apart. Loki moved like a shadow, slipping through the side of the chamber to pull broken rune charms from the walls and toss them into the center line where the seal was weakest. Edda knelt despite her age, white hair falling forward as she traced the old warning signs and spoke the missing words of the lock. Her calm voice gave the others the pattern they needed. For a moment, the chamber balanced on the edge of collapse. Victor stood in the middle of it all, the frost blade shaking in his hand because he now saw the cost of his choice. He had wanted the realms to share his suffering, but he was staring at a prison that could swallow all of them if he kept feeding it. His grief did not disappear, it still lived in him, yet he also saw that grief had made him easy to guide. That truth broke his stern expression in a way no battle had done before. He finally lowered the frost blade, not in surrender but in doubt. And that single choice changed the shape of the room. The frost shape below the floor faltered, its bright center flickering as the seal began to close. Thor felt the shift and he used it. Instead of striking harder, he called to Victor across the roar of ice and thunder, telling him that real strength was not making everyone suffer the same way. Real strength was choosing what to protect, even after pain. Those words landed deeper than any blow could have. Victor looked at the shaking roots, at Vance, at the others, and at the hidden path that still led farther into Yggdrasil. He saw that if he kept going alone, he would help free the thing that had fed on his grief from the start. So he took one slow step back, then another. He did not become a friend in that moment, and he did not suddenly become gentle, but he stopped being only a weapon for the cold. Edda finished the last rune, and the floor seal slammed shut with a heavy pulse of gold light. The frost shape collapsed inward, trapped again beneath the roots. The chamber quieted, but the victory felt thin because the hidden path ahead still breathed cold from deeper within the tree. Thor raised his spear and looked into that darkness, knowing he had gained more than a victory. He had gained the trust of the others through action, not force. Loki gave him one quick glance that said the next step would be worse. Freya tightened her grip on her shield. Vance retreated into the side shadows, still cold and dangerous. Victor stood silent, now burdened by the truth that he had helped awaken a prison he never meant to open. And deep in the roots of Yggdrasil, far beyond the sealed chamber, something ancient stirred in the cold and waited for them to come closer. The inside of Yggdrasil felt colder than any winter field, and the root chamber around them seemed alive with slow, heavy breathing. Towering roots twisted above and below like giant arms, and pale frost crawled across the cracked bark walls in thin, nervous lines. Thor stood at the front with his storm spear held low, his bright red hair shining under the cold light, and his heavy gold and silver armor made him look like a shield for the whole world. Behind him, Loki moved with careful steps, his long black hair falling over dark green and black clothing, his sharp eyes watching every shadow. Freya kept close to the center, her golden hair tied back under polished bronze and steel armor, her red cloak hanging like a warning banner. Edda, the oldest of them, stood with her worn blue cloak and white hair, her small metal charms clicking softly as she studied the rune marks in the wood. Victor was there too, tall and stiff in pale armor marked by frost, his gray hair damp with cold, and his forbidden blade resting in his hand like a memory he could not drop. Vance lingered near the side shadows, broad and silent, his white hair wild around his dark icy armor, and his glowing cold eyes made the chamber feel even smaller. The danger was simple and terrible now. If they moved too slowly, the frost curse would spread into the roots, lock the living tree in ice, and trap every realm in the same bitter pain that Victor wanted to share. Thor understood the threat clearly, and so did the others. But deep under the floor, beyond the sealed chamber they had already crossed, something ancient was stirring, and it was waiting for them to come closer. Edda was the first to break the silence. She raised one hand toward a set of broken rune lines near the wall, and her calm face hardened as she read the old warning signs carved there by hands long forgotten. She explained that the prison below Yggdrasil had not been made for a person or for a monster in the normal sense, but for a force that fed on sorrow and turned it into frost. Long ago, the builders of the tree had hidden that force because it could creep into roots, freeze holy ground, and wake through regret. That was why the chamber mattered so much. If the prison cracked fully open, the cold would not stay in one place. It would travel through the roots into Asgard, into the bridges, into the forged temples, and then into the rest of the 9 realms. Freya tightened her grip on her shield when she heard that. As the bridge captain, she had spent her life protecting travelers from frost raids, and she knew what happened when winter reached frightened people who had no defense. Her brave face stayed steady, but her voice grew sharper as she asked what had broken the seal. The answer made everyone turn toward Victor. He did not look away. He said that he had followed grief into Niflheim, found the forbidden frost blade, and believed he could use its power to make the world understand his pain. He had not wanted to awaken a prison. He had wanted revenge on a world that kept moving while his own heart stayed broken. Yet the blade had answered his sorrow, and the seal had reacted to that cold promise. Thor felt anger rise in his chest because Victor had helped open a wound in the center of the sacred tree, but he also saw something worse in Victor's face. This was not simple evil. This was a man who had let pain become a weapon, and now he could not easily tell where the weapon ended and he began. Loki moved first because he always did when a room became too dangerous for straight answers. He walked toward the center of the chamber, then stopped beside a line of roots that looked ordinary at first glance. With one gloved hand, he brushed away frost, and a narrow seam of faint gold light appeared between 2 massive roots. It was a hidden root path, thin as a blade, and it seemed to lead deeper into the heart of Yggdrasil. Loki gave a quick glance to Thor that said this was the next step, and it would be worse. He then explained, in his quiet and careful way, that the old builders had not only sealed the prison below. They had also built escape routes, false paths, and trap lines to confuse anyone who came later with greedy hands. That meant the chamber was not only a prison site, it was also a test. Someone had designed it to force a choice. Move forward and the path might reveal the source of the cold. Turn back and the frost would keep spreading behind them. Thor gripped the storm spear tighter and blue lightning crawled along the sacred metal, answering his focus. He was not the same fighter he had been at the start of this journey. He no longer rushed at every threat with loud force alone. He listened now, he watched, he let trust guide his strength. That change mattered because the others were starting to follow his lead. Even Freya, who had once doubted him, stepped in beside him without hesitation. Vance, however, stayed half hidden in the shadowed edge of the chamber, his cold eyes locked on Victor with a look that was almost hungry. Vance had always turned sorrow into ice, and the frost in his dark armor seemed to throb when he heard Victor speak. He believed pain should harden a person into something stronger, not softer. In his mind, Victor had not failed. He had simply moved too slowly. That made Vance dangerous because he did not just support the frost curse, he admired what it could do to a heart. The group stepped through the hidden root path together, and the chamber behind them seemed to close in with every step. The passage was narrow, rough, and wet with cold, and the living wood around them shivered as if it hated their touch. Edda walked near the front now, her old boots steady on the root floor, and she traced each rune mark with careful fingers so she would not miss a trap. Freya followed beside her, shield raised, always ready to guard the weak point in the line. Thor came after them with his storm spear glowing in short blue flashes, and every burst of lightning pushed back the frost for one breath at a time. Loki stayed just behind Thor, silent and quick, his eyes darting from crack to crack, always searching for the trick that would save them later. Victor walked in the middle, not trusted but not cast out either. That position said everything about where the group stood. He was still part of the mission, but he had to earn every second of that chance. The deeper they went, the stranger the tree became. Thick roots bent into archways. Pale frost flowers spread across bark, then shattered when Thor passed. Strange whispers moved through the wood, and they did not sound like voices from the team. They sounded like memory itself, repeating old grief over and over. Then the path opened into a larger hollow, and all of them stopped at once. Before them lay the frost shape below. It was not fully formed, but it was no longer just a lump of cursed ice. It had a shifting humanoid shape, jagged shoulders, a long curved back, and a bright cold light pulsing inside its center like a frozen heart. Around it, the roots of Yggdrasil had begun to crack, and beside the shape, half buried in ice, was an old forge mark that Edda recognized at once. It matched the same sacred pattern used to imprison the force long ago. That was the twist that changed everything. Victor had not only awakened a prison by accident, he had also followed the same trail the old builders once feared, because the forbidden blade had been made to answer that buried force, not merely to destroy. The weapon had been a key all along, and Victor had been carrying it toward the exact place where the ancient cold could wake fully. Victor stared at the frost shape below, and for the first time his stern face lost its hard edge. He realized the truth at the same moment as the others. The blade he had taken from Niflheim had not simply been cursed. It had been shaped to serve the thing beneath the tree, and every drop of grief he fed into it had helped call the prison open. His hands shook, and he looked as if the weight of that truth might crush him. Yet the ancient force below did not wait for remorse. The frost shape below rose higher, and the chamber filled with a sharp blast of freezing air that struck the walls, the roots, and their armor all at once. Freya braced her shield and pushed back the first wave. Vance stepped forward from the dark and slammed his own cold power outward, not to help, but to claim the battle for himself. Ice spread in a jagged rush from his feet, and for one brief second it looked as if he might join the growing force below instead of the people beside him. Thor drove his storm spear into the floor, and thunder exploded in a bright blue ring that shattered the worst of the frost and gave the others room to breathe. Loki darted through the chaos, cutting open frozen runes on the roots before they could seal shut, and Edda shouted the only warning that mattered. The chamber was beginning to wake fully, and if its center opened, the prison would no longer hold anything. Thor understood at once that brute force alone would fail here. He looked at Victor, then at the others, and made a choice that changed the shape of the fight. He did not order Victor away, he asked him to help. Victor stared back, stunned by the chance, because for the first time since this nightmare began, someone was trusting him to act instead of punishing him for the past. He lifted the forbidden blade with a bitter, shaking breath, and the cold in the room answered him at once. The frost shape below surged in reply, as if it had been waiting for that very moment. Thor planted his feet and raised the storm spear overhead, while Freya held the center line and Loki slipped toward the side roots to search for the hidden lock. Edda pressed her palm to the rune wall and began to speak the old warning words in a low, steady voice. Her calm did not remove the fear, but it gave the others something solid to stand on. Victor stepped forward with the forbidden blade, and instead of driving it into the growing frost, he turned it sideways and used it to pull the cold away from the roots. That choice cost him, because the blade resisted him hard, and the chamber filled with a bitter shock that ran through his arms. Still, he held it. He held it because he finally understood that his pain did not have to become the world's fault. It could end with him, it could stop here. The frost shape below thrashed against the root floor, and the hidden path behind them began to glow brighter, as if the whole tree was deciding whether to open or collapse. Then Loki found the lock. He called out that the root chamber had a second seal, hidden under the forge mark, and that seal could be broken only if the cold and the storm struck it together. Thor looked to Victor one last time, and Victor nodded with grim certainty. For the first time, the two men stood on the same side of the choice. Thunder slammed down through the storm spear, frost snapped upward from the forbidden blade, and the rune seal blazed with violent light. The frost shape below screamed in silent energy and was forced backward into the deep crack beneath the floor, but the crack did not close. It widened just enough to show a darker chamber below, where something far older and far larger waited in the cold. The team did not have time to see what it was, only enough to know it had heard them. Thor held his ground as the wind roared through the roots. Freya kept her shield up. Edda went pale at the sight. Loki narrowed his eyes, and Victor whispered that the prison below was not empty. Then the chamber trembled again, the hidden root path behind them began to crumble, and the ancient thing beneath Yggdrasil stirred once more, ready for the next step they would have to take. The root chamber shook under a cold wind, and the air felt sharp enough to bite. Thor, a man with bright red hair and heavy gold and silver armor, planted his storm spear into the ground and stood as the first wall against the dark. Freya, a woman with golden hair and shield-capped armor, kept her bronze shield high. Loki, a man with long black hair and dark green clothing, watched every crack. Edda, a woman with white hair and rune keeper straps, stared at the floor with calm fear. Victor, a tall man with gray hair and pale frost armor, smiled with no warmth because he wanted the realms to share the pain he had carried alone. The floor split wider, and the frost shape below pushed up from the prison like a giant cold hand. It was not a true body yet, only a shifting mass with a bright center and jagged edges. Victor raised the forbidden frost blade and cold light ran through the chamber. He had found this prison long ago, and he had fed it grief, loss, and rage until it could answer him. He believed that if Asgard froze, then every happy world would finally understand him. That was why the curse had spread so fast, and that was why the danger now reached Yggdrasil itself. Edda shouted that the root path behind them was collapsing, but she also saw the truth hidden in the rune marks. The prison was not holding a monster. It was holding Victor's curse in place, and if it broke cleanly, the cold would race through the tree. Loki moved first, slipping around Victor and striking the blade from his hand with a quick twist and a clean shove. Freya drove her shield forward and forced the frost shape to recoil. Thor then lifted the storm spear, called thunder through the roots, and aimed the strike into the cracked rune line. The chamber flashed blue and white. The frost shape shattered into drifting ice dust. Victor fell to one knee, and the buried prison sealed itself again. Then a new sound came from deep below, softer and wiser than the first. It was the heart of Yggdrasil waking, not in anger but in warning. Thor looked at his team, and for the first time he saw the whole truth. Strength alone would not save the realms. They would need trust, patience, and each other. As the last stones settled and the hidden root path finally vanished, the four heroes turned toward the next dark passage with steady hearts, while Victor was forced back into silence and the winter curse lost its grip on the tree.